Yo, Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Shalom, good evening, and welcome to the Big Daddy Liberty Show. That's right, it's Mina Sihle Ngobese, aka Big Daddy Liberty. Oh, do I not have a fantastic guest for you guys tonight? But before I get into any of that, guys, get the comments through. I do see them. I will flag them on screen. And if there are any questions you have, of course, you're welcome to pass those on also. Remember, guys, you can support the Big Daddy Liberty Show and the work that I do here in South Africa of spreading classically liberal ideas in our communities across the country by contributing to the show. How do you do that, you're wondering? Just check it out in the descriptor of the video. Welcome to it, guys. As you enter, please smash that like button. I'm sure the folks will start trickling in rather soon. I did mention I have a very special guest with me in the house. I've got, of course, James Lindsay. That's James Lindsay. I hope I'm not butchering his surname, but James is wow, where do I begin? A very interesting character if you follow him on his social media, specifically on Twitter. It's at Conceptual James. And this is a chap who really shot into the limelight, if I can call it that, within the academic world by questioning some of the dubious work that we were beginning to see in the academic world. One of the first books that I, if not the book that I remember of James was Cynical Theories, which he wrote with Helen Pluckrose and that was just Helen Pluckrose and him, which was basically looking at the academic world and the various approaches to activism and scholarship. The authors, of course, were looking at various fields, in particular in academia, of schools of thought, such as post-colonial theory, queer theory, critical race theory, which we've discussed on this show, intersectionality, the sort of waves of feminism that is now being thrown at us, gender studies, fat studies, you name it. And they were questioning some of the approaches to this, to these fields of study. But hey, let me not butcher the intro and exactly who James is and what he does. Let me actually just bring him on to screen. Now, bear with me, guys. I'm trialing a new system here where my laptop is. There it is. Oh, it works. It works rather nicely. James, good evening and welcome to the Big Daddy Liberty Show. What an honor to have you.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Fantastic, my brother. We are perhaps going to hop straight into it, maybe just with a brief, descriptor. Who's James, and what is your academic background? Because I sort of did try and frame this within, as James having taken on the academic establishment. But James, what are you all about before we get into the topic tonight?
I mean, honestly, I'm just against totalitarianism in all forms. That's like a first thing to say. So I guess I'm about liberty. I'm about freedom, about people living their lives the way that they want to, of course, within the consistency of, not being aggressive and not limiting other people's freedoms. But I also am about, I famously, I think once said that I got into all this because I'm allergic to two things, which are unfairness and bullshit. And there's just a massive amount of both happening around these various, what do we call them, cynical theories or whatever. So I got my doctorate in mathematics in 2010, academically speaking, and then I already saw there were troubles in the university. I didn't realize this woke problem yet. I don't want to act like I was, had great foresight. I saw a bent toward student services. I saw a bent toward student retention in particular, like the universities would do anything to keep students. And this is how you end up with, as they say, the inmates running the asylum before too long, which is exactly what happened, because the law of the most intolerant is going to apply. So the 1 or 2% of students who are the most messed up are going to end up running the whole show if the university or the institution is going to bend over backwards to keep them. I didn't put all that together, but I realized this is a bad model. I can't teach under these conditions. I don't want to keep teaching under these conditions. I had some stuff going on with my family too, so I bailed out. I care about my family, that kind of guy, So I bailed out on academia in 2010, got involved in the culture wars through the internet, by 2011 and 12. And I watched basically the new atheism movement get blown up. It had a Me Too in 2011 under the name Elevator Gate, and it got blown up. And basically the whole thing fell apart within a few years. And I thought, this is horrible. And we kind of got introduced to these academic theories because people were accusing everybody of sexism and misogyny. And I'm like, how? And then they said, well, sexism and misogyny are systemic. And so the next thing you know, I'm reading gender studies literature, and we have this idea that, the gender studies literature is kind of like the epicenter of the big problem. So we decided, as you mentioned, to write all those fake academic papers, 20 academic papers. Peter Boghossian and I, Helen Pluckrose did. And we put those out in 2017 and 18. Next thing you know, it's like everybody wants to talk to us about what's going on in academia. And I'm trying to tell people, like, it's not just academia. It's everywhere. It's government, it's businesses, it's, it's rock climbing clubs, it's Dungeons and Dragons. It's literally in everything. And so it was like, it's churches. It's not just, it's like everything. And it's actually, at that point, we had realized when we were writing some of those papers and reading some of the research they told us to read, like the peer review people told us to read, we're like, this is some dark stuff. This is like unhealthy. This is dangerous. This is encouraging abuse. I remember the day when a friend of mine and I, Mike Nana is his name, were talking, and we're like, this is a seed of a genocide. This is a dangerous set of ideas. This is not normal. Not to say that seed will sprout. I don't want to be alarmist, but it's the seed, right? It's like you're scapegoating people by their race. You're saying that people can't understand one another. No matter what they do. You're telling certain people that their stories have been told and that the trauma that they experience is justified. This is dangerous stuff.
Absolutely. And again, I want to get into this as far as possible within the context of South Africa, because we've definitely imported these ideas and these approaches in our own universities here. And the thing about universities is, they supply, if you will, in our particular case, universities are spaces where obviously students walk in and graduates come out, the very same graduates who then enter the world of work and enter institutions of society, which are absolutely important, whether those institutions are government, the media in this country, or even the workplace, inevitably. And the wonderful thing that you guys did, and this is where I want to begin slightly before I ask you to define what the social justice ideology, is, or critical theory and critical race theory. Before we get into that, I want to look at this, what you guys did. You and Helen Pluckrose and, of course, Peter Boghossian, what's now broadly being called the grievance study affairs, if you look it up, which was you guys seeking to highlight what you saw was poor scholarship and really an eroding criteria in many academic fields. These fields in particular were, of course, those that are in the social sciences, as we call them here in South Africa, or the liberal arts, which were, as you mentioned, pushing a lot of these bad ideas into not only the student space or the academic space, but almost treating them as, this is it. This is the only manner in which you can view the world, the only manner in which you can teach a lot of these subjects. Talk to me about what prompted you guys to even, firstly, what did you guys do? Let me just begin there. What did you guys do, and what prompted you guys to do it?
Yeah, well, what we did was we wrote as many academic research articles, which, by the way, those are hard. They usually 1 or 2 a year is a good output for a scholar. We wrote as many of them as we could in the shortest amount of time possible. We thought we'd have about a year. We ended up having 10 months during which we felt like we could write new papers. We wrote 20 of them. So to give you an idea, that's incredibly fast. It's like it's 12 times or something as fast as normal. And we're just pumping these things out. And we submitted those to the highest ranking academic journals that we could, the most serious research journals, Feminist Philosophy Journal, et cetera. And the goal was to see what would they take, and what does it take to get these papers in if we just kind of make it up and say ridiculous things. And they ended up accepting 7 of them, of those 20, and 7 more were still under review because we got caught by the Wall Street Journal in the middle of it, and they told our story, and we had to pull everything to a halt. So they accepted 7, with 7 more under review. We might have probably, I think it's fair to say we would have certainly gotten 11 of the 20, maybe 12 in had we, had no time limits on us.
Sure.
And so This, I thought, what we were actually doing, and this is what's so important, is that we were trying to demonstrate that you actually can just start with your conclusion and make it up to get to make up the argument to get there, which means you're not actually doing scholarship, you're not actually doing research, you're not actually looking at the world and trying to figure out what's going on. You already know what you want to say, and you do it backwards. And so that's really what we were trying to do. So we would come up with these absurd conclusions or policy recommendations or something. Like, for example, I think our most famous paper is about dogs. And we started with the idea that rape culture is this huge problem. And to fix rape culture, if we could just train men the way that we train dogs, they wouldn't be able to rape anymore. And so we used the setting of the dog park with dogs humping each other and the way that people like intervene with their dogs as a model for stopping rape culture. And this is utterly absurd. And of course, we put in the most like ridiculous stuff that we could think of, like that we examined 10,000 dogs' genitals and asked people about their sexual orientations right afterwards, like stuff that just doesn't make sense. But what we were really doing was we were using people's reactions. I mean, to make it a little bit more serious, we were using people's reactions to allegedly having seen dogs hump each other at the park as an implicit bias test about their attitudes about whether or not women, are sex objects, which is just completely ridiculous. It's utterly ridiculous.
I mean, you must forgive me for giggling incessantly at this, because again, having myself been through, university in the social sciences, I know exactly what you're referring to. And how these things become, they take over by and large, and no other way of science. In fact, no, excuse me, I take 2 steps back. Scientific inquiry, as we've traditionally understood it as it being a reliable and verifiable tool, is perverted completely by people who have an openly stated and almost implicitly sought ideological outlook to an approach to the social sciences. And this is the problem. And this is what I want to get into, therefore. What are some of these ideologies that we're sort of broadly referring to here? And I'm going to throw these terms out, and I want you to sort of get into a descriptor of what they are and why they've become so pervasive. So I think the first one, which as we as South Africans have come to understand now, is this notion of social justice, and broadly the social justice ideology or movement, as they self-describe. It being a broad umbrella, what is it, and what are some of the things underneath it that define it?
Sure. So you are correct. First of all, social justice is a very broad umbrella, and there are a lot of very reasonable ways to think about the subject of social justice. So this is the thing that's really common with these ideologies, is that they use words in a lot of different ways at the same time, so that they can convince people they're on the good guy side when they're actually doing something horrible. So at the most superficial level, it's something most people, I think almost everybody in the world now supports, which is, the idea of having a more fair society where people are not judged discriminatorily or through prejudice or whatever else. And I think almost everybody's on board with that. But when you get a little deeper into the literature, even within the soft stuff, they still describe it as being the pursuit not of individual rights, but of group rights, which is a scary concept because groups aren't people. And so what does it mean for a group to have rights? It's a very strange thing. That is a distinction, and I want to make it very clear. That's a distinction from that, so if you look, for example, I'm sure, South Africa has this history, the United States has this history where there was the exclusion from rights based on group membership in the past.
Right.
That's one thing. And to say, oh, well, those individuals have rights is an answer to that. But then to say we need group-based rights is a different answer, right? I want to make that pretty clear. That's a very different thing. So it is the pursuit of group-based rights, according to at least one of their education manuals that I've read, where they give a very clear description that's interested in group-based rights. Now, the thing is, though, is that the movement doesn't just approach the idea of social justice. You can even read in some of their books, they write things like, some people use the phrase social justice to kind of keep it close to its true commitments, but we actually are doing something called critical social justice. So in other words, they're saying, oh, those true commitments, whatever you think about the group rights question, whatever you think about fairness in society, what they're saying is, we don't actually mean that. We mean something else. So the movement is something called critical social justice that's rooted in something called critical theory, and that's where you get ideas like critical race theory, where they're going to use these critical theory methods, which is literally to say neo-Marxist thinking, systems-based thinking based on the kind of analysis of Marx applied to cultural artifacts and identity artifacts instead. We're going to use that now to try to achieve group-based so-called rights, usually under headings like equity, for example, which is to redistribute resources and opportunity and power and privilege such that, you know, various groups are going to be redefined in terms of how much of that they have.
And again, even as you say this, I know the South Africans who are watching this are going, oh, hang on, this sounds very, very familiar. We are very well attuned to this as South Africans. And in fact, with that being said, welcome to it. If you're just joining us on the Big Daddy Liberty Show, I'm in conversation with James Lindsay from America, a chap who has built quite a body of work, both in the world of tweets and, of course, literature and books, going after some of these bad ideas that we're beginning just to chew into as to what they are. James, you know, anybody who would have just heard you now would have gone, hey man, we've heard these buzzwords as South Africans all too familiarly, especially within media, mainstream media, ever increasingly within you know, formal politics and even the institutions of the state, and of course within the chattering classes, broadly speaking. Let me pick apart a few, because we've seen an obsession in South African society with race primarily and gender, the other one. Nothing else has mattered now in terms of social discourse except these two things, both in, firstly, analyzing the social ills that we've faced as South Africans, and secondly, in prescribing how we sort them out, fix them, and the like, or interventions to address them. So it's both the analysis and what we prescribe. You know, race and gender have been the two things that have dominated this. And the question often is why? And I think this is where something like critical race theory comes into play. What is critical race theory, and why is it so toxic or problematic? And I'm using these two words on purpose. I'm actually being rather facetious, but why are these something that parents, for example, as it filters into schools, or we as ordinary citizens, as it filters into institutions of state, should be attuned to it and aware of it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things you could say about critical race theory. It's this kind of sprawling set of ideas. But the key idea at the bottom of critical race theory is that it believes that the system itself, the whole operation of society, including how you talk to one another, how we construct ideas, is all based in race and racism. Racism is the fundamental ordering, like the force that orders society. And it is the most fundamental thing. So it's automatically going to make people think in terms of race and racism constantly. So obviously that's going to usually end up being quite divisive, even though they claim that it's supposed to be the way to get out of the racial division. And so what it actually begins with is this one assumption, though, that racism is the ordinary state of affairs. And furthermore, that state of affairs is what they call structurally determinant on society. So if you happen to be of this race, then you have these outcomes likely to occur to you. If you have this other race, then these outcomes are what are open to you. And if you defy the odds, you probably had to do something, you know, we have over here a phrase, acting white, if you, you know, are successful or whatever, which is really kind of disgusting. It's a very disgusting idea. It's also inimical, you know, this is a show about liberty. It's inimical to liberty and liberalism, you know, classical liberal ideals. You can quote straight out of the textbook, Critical Race Theory and Introduction. I do this all the time. I love sharing this quote. People need to be aware of it. It's in the first paragraph in a section titled, "What is Critical Race Theory?" And it says that critical race theory calls into question the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory. So equality's out. Legal reasoning, rule of law is no good. Enlightenment rationalism. So, you know, the idea that we can think through and be rational about our problems, that's a problem. We got to get rid of that. And neutral principles of constitutional law is another thing that it calls into question. Later in the same book, a few pages later, 20 pages later, says that critical race theorists are highly suspicious of another liberal mainstay, namely rights. And so it's inimical to the idea that individuals would have rights, because it wants to forward this identity politics through a lens of, I know it's a high tech, I don't want to sound so technical, but I want to use their terms clearly so people understand. Through that lens of structural determinism, that if you were born black, that means something is going to happen in your life. If you were born white, then that means something's going to happen in your life. You're going to have privilege, you're going to have, you know, whatever, you're going to have oppression, you're going to have whatever. And this is a very dangerous way to look at the world. But as we've already alluded to, it's derived from that conflict theory that's at the heart of Marxism. It's derived from the idea that society is split into the haves and have-nots, where Marx had it with wealth, with economic, standing. They have it with privilege. This concept of privilege, that these unearned advantages based on structural determinism, based on who you happen to have been born to be. And so its answer is that everybody has to lean into the racial groups. Everybody has to become cognizant of their race and what that structural determinism is and what that says about them and what they therefore need to do in accordance with that. So, I mean, it's just such, I don't know any other way to say it. It's just such a racist ideology. It denies
Absolutely.
the fact of individuals being able to determine their own lives because they're caught up in these racial categories, which it then, kind of turns in this very, the term in Marxism is conflict theory. So it's very conflict-oriented arrangement. Like for right now, critical race theory, since we are not of the same race, would identify that you and I that there's a racist dynamic happening. And of course, because I happen to be white and you happen to be black, we know what direction that has to point. So I must be being racist to you somehow, according to critical race theory. And critical race theorists are the people who are able to magically find that, usually hidden in my intentions. Like they can read my mind and figure that I must have some kind of racist intention here.
Yes, I was about to say the hunt for the eternal racism or the eternal apartheid in this country. Let me cite an example of how, for example, we as South Africans have seen this ideology play itself out and how it's really been, to a rather dangerous level, been adopted by the political elites in this country. There was a court case, or there is a court case currently happening in one of our rural provinces in Mpumalanga, in a town called Piet Retief. Now, I'd done a show about this. I went out to the town itself. It's a bit like small town South Africa, essentially, where, and I'll condense the issue. Basically, 5 men are accused of killing 2 brothers. Of the 5 men, 4 are white and 1 is black. And these are 4 farmers, or 5 farmers, effectively, all in all. But as this story broke in the news cycle, what eventually happened was the politicians in this country, race-baiting politicians at that, gaslit their supporters and literally descended on this town as mobs, organized mobs, to not only intimidate the residents of this town, but to quite literally riot in some cases. I mean, the first 2 days of the court appearance saw people sort of taking to the streets, throwing stones, damaging shop fronts, targeting white residents of that town. White people basically were, in some cases, chased, cars stoned, and a few people actually stabbed in this incident. The whole thing literally gaslit by politicians who argued the following, not knowing the merits of the case, but just simply argued the following. Well, because of the 5 accused, 4 are white, this is clearly evidence that in this country, white people hate black South Africans, are willing to murder black South Africans, and this is what it really is. It's the wanton disregard for black lives, and of course the murdering of these 2 brothers who were but mere peaceful work seekers coming to seek work on these farms. Now, this was the narrative that was sold by politicians, of course, looking to use this incident in order to play up the racial tropes, the idea that you judge people based on their race. Despite what the facts say, despite what the evidence say, this was their narrative. And of course, South Africa being a country that still has the rule of law, by and large, in terms of just a judicial system that works, none of this was, in terms of the bail hearing, the actual established facts of this case. Of course, this is still an ongoing case, so I'm not going to make any pronouncement, but there are contested truths in there. But the evidence is pointing out that actually this was not a racial incident per se, because of one of the brothers that was murdered was actually on the side of the farmers, defending what was his workplace against another brother who came to antagonize. Again, this is according to the statements in court. I'm not saying this is or wasn't. I'm just going off what was said in court. But the point is this that I wanted to get to. You can go down the line in South African society and find cases like these, where it is often the political elites, woke academia in this country, and really the chattering classes who are hell-bent in suggesting that South Africa is a society of blacks and whites who are near the brink of a race war, when the evidence actually isn't here. But there's a reason why they do this, isn't there, James? And again, maybe cite some American examples in your case. There is definitely a reason why it's often the elites who are the purveyors of these ideas, despite even what maybe ordinary Americans or ordinary South Africans actually say or do and as their everyday engagement.
No, I listened to that whole thing and I thought, wow, that's just like America right now. I mean, we have so many high-profile cases where you have, everything being blamed on white supremacy. I have this running joke on Twitter where an Asian American will get attacked, Chinese or Korean or Japanese or whatever will get attacked. It's usually, but not always, by a black individual. It's very rarely by a white individual. But I have this button meme where somebody's slapping a big blue button and it says white supremacist, because immediately that's the narrative. And this is actually a key, like I want people to understand that this is a key tenet. This isn't like an occurrence that happens because, or a consequence of critical race theory. This is a key tenet of critical race theory, is that the facts and the evidence are less important, as they say, than narrative spinning and counter storytelling. So what they do is they use examples like this and they frame them in a particular narrative way. And the goal is actually to inflame these issues. If you follow critical race theory, very rarely says it explicitly, but if you follow backwards to the critical theory that it's derived from, they very explicitly say that people have to basically be awakened to the nature of their oppression. They have to be awakened to just how bad and racist or structurally disadvantaged they are. And the only way to do that is to by constantly telling them this narrative over and over and over again. Here's another example of how you're oppressed. Here's another example of oppression. Here's another example of oppression. And it's the goal is to awaken what the critical theorists in the 1960s called a critical consciousness, or what they call a critical race consciousness, or just a race consciousness now. Or the slang word for that, of course, is woke, that you've become woke to the real systemic nature of problems in society. So we saw, for example, with George Floyd getting killed last year, immediately all of these Black Americans coming out and saying things like, even though there are only 9, the facts on the ground are only 9 unarmed Black people killed by police in 2019. We feel like we're being murdered by police every day. So you already have jumping from the word killed to murdered. And, then we feel like it's happening every day. If this is the experience that we have, but that's just storytelling. And then they cherry pick narratives. Like there was even a story in America just recently where I forget what happened, but a police officer shot somebody and Black Lives Matter ramped into action and they got their marches and everything geared up. And then the facts of the case came out and it turns out that the guy the cop shot was white and they all had to go home real fast because it fell apart on them real quick. But they were ready to march and probably riot and carry on. Until they found out that it wasn't a Black person that had been shot. And of course, there's a very famous incident now where the police officer shot the Black teenager woman who was trying to stab another one. Like, this guy deserves a medal, saved her life. And now this is obviously white supremacy because he happened to be a police officer. And we have literally our top politicians saying we have to say this girl's name, who was literally trying to drive a knife into this other teenage girl's body in that instant. Like, the video's unambiguous as to what was going on. So this is the whole thing, though, is that you have to make the narrative. You have to make the narrative. Say her name, blah, blah, blah. Say, make it personal. That's Saul Alinsky. Bring up that personal aspect. Make it personal. And drive these issues. And you are right. It is the elites who are definitely trying to push this because it keeps us divided and it keeps us, with American politics, it was able to be foisted into this huge narrative that Trump himself is a racist and Trump was encouraging racism, blah, blah, blah. And so what do you end up seeing? You end up seeing so much fear and panic around Trump that we have this record turnout allegedly in this election we just had. And Biden, both candidates got the number 1 and number 2 most votes of any candidate ever in an American election somehow, because people are so panicked because they've driven this narrative and they used that racist narrative, or racism narrative, I should say, to push Trump out of office. And now, people they're having the buyer's remorse, but it's like, this is a very powerful tool and it's being used very deliberately by people who are in power because they know that it allows them to manipulate the political situation, manipulate people into doing things they wouldn't otherwise do. And if you keep people with this idea that we're right at the edge of a race war and you're constantly feeding them a story about power dynamics, man, you can really generate some hate. You can really generate some political mobilization. You can really get people to do some stuff that's dangerous.
And that's the key right there. That's the key right there. It's this idea that quite often it is a very small grouping of individuals with political power looking to drive a massive wedge in a society that is often not interested in a racial divide, a gender divide, or anything like that, because it's not part of our everyday lexicon. Again, without going into the data of this, there are numerous, sorry, I thought of the sentence in Zulu. Let me just quickly translate in my mind. There are numerous studies in this country, polls that are often done, gauging the public opinion of South Africans on issues of race and the like. And they consistently come out as showing that South Africans do not consider race as being at the top of the issues or priorities in which they think about or deal with on an everyday basis. But I'm going to shift our conversation a little bit just as we conclude, because I know we're in the final 15 minutes of the show. And thank you so much for giving me that extra bit of time.
I'll tell you, by the way, I found the racism because I don't speak Zulu, and that's what it was.
You know, oh, how dare you, James? You know, are you assuming my language?
I did. Oh no.
But James, you know, I really meant it when I said that these ideas are we almost import them as carbon copies from America. We even don't even tweak them at all. Let me be precise and specific. Last year, during our hard lockdown, I'm just finding the piece. So if you see me looking down, please forgive me. I'm just reading here. During our hard lockdown, there was a school, really schools, and all of them are highly sort of private schools, the sort of creme de la creme of South African society go to these schools. And they were citing that these schools were just the epicenter of racism and discrimination and bigotry in South Africa. I'm talking about some of the most privileged South Africans, black and white, to go to these schools. And one particular matric class at Bishops, which is a school in Cape Town, cited, for instance, that there was systemic racism, and I'm using this word on purpose because it's the lingo that goes to them. There was quote systemic racism and oppression in the school, and they developed a list of 20 demands in a memorandum that they then passed on to the school administration. Now, I'm just going to go into some of these just to give it an indication of why I argue that they copy directly from the American textbook in this particular instance and don't even make an effort to modify it for South Africa. They then argue, for example, in their 20 list of demands, they say, if I can just quickly find this, pardon me, just give me a moment. Demand number 17, for example, says, well, they demand a safe space and forums for minority students or students from vulnerable groups. The matric said that these spaces should serve the purpose of being a space where vulnerable students can seek refuge from the harms that the school confronts them with. And, quote, under no circumstances should white people enter these POC, persons of color, an expression we don't use as South Africans, but anyway, these person of color safe spaces, and non-LGBTQI plus people should not be allowed to enter queer safe spaces. Now, James, two things. Number one, Black people in this country are not a minority by any stretch of the imagination. We make up 80% of the population in this country. So again, it's this idea that you just copy something, don't even think about the local context. And number two, for those of us who read this, for those of us who are maybe a bit more old school, who read this and heard things like white people should not enter a space for people of color, literally started thinking, well, hang on, that's the very system that our forefathers, our fathers fought against, i.e. apartheid, which it did exactly that. It created spaces for blacks and whites, Indians and coloreds in this particular country. Talk to me about this new age acceptance of segregation, or rather that segregation is okay these days, so long as you can identify it through the oppressed and the oppressor narrative.
That's amazing, isn't it? Yeah, so there is actually, I mean, I hesitate to use the word logic, but there is a logic behind that. What they believe in critical race theory explicitly says that race is imposed upon, as they phrased it, people of color by whites. This is an axiom. So white people created race so that they could do racism by imposing racial categories, by racializing people. And so what the claim in critical race theory is that if you are what they deem a person of color, or specifically, especially a black person, then you constantly experience race and racism in ways that people with white privilege are immune from. And therefore, the only way that you can get a reprieve from what they sometimes call the white male gaze, or the omnipresent white gaze, or whatever, or whiteness in general, is to create a segregated space. But they call that a desegregated space because they're claiming that the power dynamic is already inherently segregating all spaces. This goes all the way back to the very roots of critical race theory, where you see people, even in the 1970s, like Derek Bell at Harvard Law, writing that desegregation actually created a new kind of segregation where people had to be aware of their race, like a psychic segregation, and that the only way to get out of that problem is to resegregate spaces, which is just absolutely absurd. And this is, of course, as Orwellian as you can get, because you literally are calling segregation desegregation. You're calling racializing an issue deracializing it by saying that the underlying assumption is that it's already racialized. So when I said earlier that the first assumption of critical race theory is that racism is the ordinary state of affairs of society, this is the consequence of that. It's a direct consequence of that. If racism is already everywhere and it's always happening, then the only way that people of color can get psychological relief from that racism that they experience everywhere is by having a space carved out for themselves. So there's this huge drive to resegregate. And you guys are right. You're seeing it correctly. I mean, I have a meme I put up on Twitter about the water fountains or whatever. Segregated water fountains. There's a sign from 1962 or something somebody sent me where, it's like, whites only. And then there's a sign from 2020 that's, no whites allowed or whatever. It's virtually identical stuff. But I mean, again, this isn't something that's just incidental to critical race theory. This is actually a direct consequence of the first doctrine of the theory. This is the way that it thinks about the world. And this is if that's the way it views the world, this is a reliable consequence. This is what's going to happen when bureaucrats get in power and they think that they're doing good, which is, I mean, that's where C.S. Lewis said, the worst tyrant is somebody who thinks he's doing it for your own benefit. Because his conscience will never wake up because he thinks he's helping you. This is, people really do need to be concerned about this, because this is horrible. It's just horrible.
Let me take it to its final conclusion. In the last sort of 8 minutes that we have, 6, 7, 8 minutes that we have, this obviously, as I said, it's produced at the universities, and the universities produce the graduates who enter the world of work, etc., including into the state. South Africa, unfortunately, is no stranger to this, insofar as that we now have, and we've had since the dawn of our democracy nearly 30 years ago, actually institutionalized race-based law. In other words, the state picking winners and losers in society on the basis of race, and then using the Orwellian doublespeak of arguing that is non-racialism, they'll say. So along the lines of, for example, we have legislation like affirmative action, which we actually took from the Americans, and Black economic empowerment, which literally creates a hierarchy amongst our races and argues that opportunity in society should go along this hierarchy of race. And of course, gender has now been included ever recently on this particular issue. Talk to me about the dangers of this as you see them developing in America, where there's greater calls for a system like this, because we South Africans are very aware of what happens when you move in this particular direction. And then after that, I'll get into some questions, James. I know we were very short on time, but I'll get into some questions after that.
Yeah, I mean, the only way that so Jordan Peterson is very eloquent on this, and I'll just kind of quote him. He remarks that there's always going to be hierarchies in society. And he says that a hierarchy that's based on competence is the only one that's not corrupt, or the least corrupted. We talk about meritocracy. They argue meritocracy doesn't exist. And it's true. It's not totally like, we know people, if you and I are friends, I'm more likely to give you a favor than if I don't know you, right? So there is always a little bit of corruption in the system. But the more you veer toward merit, the more you veer toward competence, the less corrupt your hierarchy is going to be. When you start creating these kinds of hierarchies, you're going to just start bringing in corruption. You're also going to start bringing in a drag on society. People who think they might have been hired because of their identity, not because of their skill, are going to develop problems like imposter syndrome. They're going to underperform. Sometimes that's people who are high performers. There are also going to be people who are hired who are underperformers. Meanwhile, you're going to demotivate other people. If I don't feel like I have a good chance of getting a job, why am I going to go invest in getting my stuff together to apply for that job or whatever? So you're going to demotivate people who feel like they can't get it. So what you're going to end up doing in aggregate is you're going to lower the standard of quality that's coming out of our institutions across the board. People are going to have imposter syndrome. People are going to, incompetence is going to be rewarded for bad reasons, and you're going to demotivate other competent people, or avoid hiring other competent people to fill those slots. And meanwhile, because of what Jordan Peterson said, you're going to be generating resentment in the population across these lines. Everywhere people detect these corruptions, people hate corruption. Now, everywhere they see this corruption, they're going to get more resentful and more resentful and more resentful of the system and of each other, and you're going to increase tensions. And it's just a societal drag. So the whole thing is a nightmare. The whole thing is a disaster in the making. And it's funny, you want my opinion, it's like, you guys in South African context, you already know how bad this is, and therefore we do too, but it's been a little bit longer for us. And it's just horrific to watch people reinventing it, thinking they're doing the good thing, right?
And that's what makes it incredibly frightening, in the sense that, again, it's a constant barrage, a bombardment of these bad ideas, which unfortunately for us have really found themselves into the institutions of state and government, and they're having a real world effect. For instance, I'll set one example before I come to this question. You can have a situation in this country, because of the obsession on race, that two Black individuals, one who grows up in a shack or a shanty on a sand dune in Cape Town somewhere, and another young Black man who grows up in the lap of luxury. Maybe his father is a CEO of a massive state-run organization, millionaire type, goes to the best schools, etc., etc. Both of these individuals, one of them recognizes where truly their disadvantage lies, which is their circumstances. Maybe they were born in a single-parent household, obviously the disadvantage of not having money and being poor. However, the chap who is Black, because of the narrative of the day, which views race as his disadvantage, will see himself as exactly the same as the poor Black chap who grew up in a shack on a sand dune, and see no irony in that, and still proceed to argue, having grown up amongst, for example, other wealthy Black individuals, other wealthy white individuals, that somehow they are an oppressed grouping in our country. It's a complete perversion of what actually is, through through what should generally be a proper inquiry into what advantages or disadvantages there are in society. The obsession on race and gender has perverted any other metric that we could be looking at to describe why there are disadvantaged people and advantaged people. And with that being said, let me get to this question, please, James. I must be fair to my viewers. Patrick Chauke asking, can you please ask James how the COVID-19 lockdowns, for example, and the death of George Floyd made the social justice warrior and critical race theory mainstream, made those two? And I'd like to know why Mr. Kendi or Dr. Kendi works, why his work is bad in the USA and South Africa.
Sure. Just to tell you a really quick story based on what you just said, I one time gave a talk, and I'll make it very brief, about this rising social justice issue. And this woman got very mad in the middle of my talk and screamed out at me that I was a fraud, because social justice is an economic issue, not about identity. So she is old school and she knew, right? So this does mask real. If we care about social justice, as I started with, this stuff masks that, it hides it. Now, as for how this stuff mainstreamed, I mean, obviously they leveraged the tension around the virus, the fact that they were able to exploit the narrative of racial disparities in the outcomes of the virus, who's dying the most often, who is getting the highest rates. But they also were able to exploit, the narrative around George Floyd, that this was yet another example of a brutal, they said, murder of a innocent Black man, which isn't even true, by a white police officer with racist police, blah, 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 which is a narrative they've been pushing very effectively since 2014. But I don't want people to come away thinking that this year is what mainstreamed it, except at the very most superficial level. It started to mainstream in American society at least by 2010 or 11. And they were pushing that on the back of the reaction to Obama's election. I've identified that as a major cause. We pushed it heavily with the Black Lives Matter thing arising in 14 and 15. They pushed it very heavily again to oppose Trump. They tried to frame Trump as a racist all through 2015 and 16. Then when he got elected, the explanation was we must be a racist country. They've done nothing but repeat that, with his various travel bans, the naming China as the source of the virus that originated in China, etc. And so they were able to just keep pushing this narrative by selectively picking, just like we talked about earlier, different things to highlight that this critical race theory analysis has the right story, which is incorrect, to tell about how we got in the world today. As for Kendi's ideas, I mean, I can just quote Kendi on one thing from his book. It's on page 19 of How to Be an Anti-Racist, where he says, the remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. That's his idea. That's the core. That is, he says, the heartbeat of racism all the time. That's the heartbeat of his idea, is that we need to put people in power who are going to get to decide the right way to discriminate. That's a terrible idea for everybody, for any country, United States, South Africa, you name it.
Well, let me show you why this is frightening and why I think every South African should be paying attention to this. Another, private school in this country, this is St. John's College, literally has embraced the doctrine of anti-racism that you just described now from Dr. Kendi. In fact, I'm citing it's on their website, a Mr. Alan Makubane, who is the deputy head of transformation and community engagement in that school. Transformation is, whenever South Africans hear the word transformation, we know that is the social justice, critical race theory, and anti-racism umbrella word. But this is the line that really popped out to me amongst other things in this particular piece. Our commitment against racism, dignity, and anti-racism policy explicitly rejects racism and all other forms of discrimination. Now, again, at the face value, nothing wrong with that. The problem is when you then start reading into the tenets that he describes, and some of the places, I won't go into great detail because I'm running even over time. Argues, for instance, continues to perpetuate this notion that the real danger faced, for example, by Black students at the school are the other white students who haven't embraced these notions, it seems to argue, in a broad sense or a broad way. And it brings in broader societal issues. For example, our version of George Floyd, if I can call it that, but really I don't want to make this what's the word I'm looking for? This analogy, but we also saw a situation where South Africans during the hard lockdown were facing the brunt of the state's violence. We had guys like Collins Khoza, for example, an individual who was beaten up by soldiers who were patrolling, keeping people within their homes. Collins Khoza was beaten to death, who, by the way, was in his own yard when this happened. And this became our rallying call, not necessarily for the racial element, because there was no racial element. It was Black soldiers, Black cops, and a Black man. But effectively, the argument I made, for example, is that the state in and of itself is absolute violence. But unfortunately, because of this George Floyd incident, our elites then brought in the race element, even though it didn't exist in this particular case. Look, I don't want to get lost in my example here because there's just one more question that I saw from the audience here. It's from Carolyn Cronier. Hi, James. Won't you please suggest your top 3 books or resources for us to read up on critical theory, critical race theory? The more we know, the better we can fight it.
So yeah, sure. I mean, I obviously have to plug my own book here at this point.
Please do.
Theories has a really good background on. So it turns out it's a complicated problem that's been brewing up for 100 or more years. But it has the corner on basically giving you an introductory primer to what's going on in these various theories, including queer theory and gender theory and feminism, but also critical race theory and post-colonial theory. But it talks about it from the angle of how postmodern philosophy is relevant to it. So it's a little bit different than what we've been talking about. If you want to know more about critical theory and critical race theory, I'm going to plug my website because I feel like I really am putting out basically the most high quality information on this, and I put
Absolutely.
it out as fast as I can. I think I've recorded something like 45 podcasts that you can go listen to this year already. Many of them, if not all of them, touch on critical race theory. There are many articles. I just published the other day a 2-page primer on critical race theory. And then the third thing that I would recommend, although I have an article, if you search for a beginner's curriculum into critical race theory or something like that on New Discourses, you can find lots more sources. But I would actually encourage everybody to go read a book called Critical Race Theory: An Introduction. It's the one I quoted from earlier. It's not a hard read. It's about 170 pages. It's actually, I read the whole thing on a flight recently. It's not difficult to read. And it's them in their own words. It's Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanczyk are the authors. I can't recommend highly enough. Just go read their own words and their own ideas in their own words, and then you'll see it's a horrible ideology, even when they try to paint it up as a good thing, especially if you care about liberty and you see how often they attack liberalism, they attack the idea of liberty, they attack the idea of rights, they talk about this weird structural determinism stuff. I mean, I found myself, I was on this airplane, my poor the guy sitting next to me, I'm literally laughing out loud at how absurd some of the stuff in the book is. So I encourage you to read their book, and Critical Race Theory and Introduction is a very accessible textbook. Anybody can pick up and read pretty easily. It takes a few hours, maybe 3 or 4 hours tops, to read the whole thing. And you'll see for yourself. You don't have to take my criticism, my word for it. Go read their own stuff. You'll see.
Absolutely. James, I have gone over time. I did only ask.
Fine. This is a great conversation.
Let me thank you for that. But perhaps before I let you go, there is something that I just saw now, gone to a grim. I put it on screen because this is an argument that really took off in this country in particular. It's this notion that Black people can't be racist. We were told that racism, by its definition, is akin to whiteness. This expression that we heard quite a lot from our elites in this country. I don't know how much of an argument it is in America, but I would safely also assume that it too is something we've imported from that part of the world. Again, it's this notion that if you belong to a victim grouping that they've identified, whether you're a victim based on race or gender, somehow you can't express racism, or you can't be racist because you, quote, do not have power in order to do that. Please talk to me about this argument. Is it something you've heard before, and why is it wrong?
Oh yeah, I mean, this is a core tenet. So they would say that Black people, for example, can be prejudiced, but they can't be racist, because being racist requires being able to tap into that system of racism. So even though they say, oh yeah, there's individual racism, and oh yeah, there's institutional racism, and all these different kinds, for them, really, the only thing that matters, for critical race theorists, I should say, that's them, the only thing that matters is the system of power. And so there's a system of power of systemic racism, they call it. And if you are acting in a racial way, in a way that upholds that system of power in any way whatsoever that they can find, doesn't matter your skin color, then you're being racist toward, it only goes in one direction, Black people. However, so for example, Kanye West put on a Make America Great Again hat, and he's being a racist because that apparently upholds white supremacy or something. But so racism is this, it's no longer what we think of it as prejudice against other people based on their skin color. It is, or their racial characteristics or whatever, or their ethnicity. It's now just, are you working in alignment with this system of power or not? And they say there's no neutral. You're either being racist by upholding it, or not resisting against it, or whatever, or you are being anti-racist by fighting against it. In other words, being one of them, because they have the only authentic way to do it. And so what this is why is it wrong? It's obviously wrong. The if you want to call it a sin, if you want to call it an evil, if you want to call it whatever you want to call it, of racism cuts through every human heart. Every individual heart can fall into this, or can rise above it, or can atone of it, or can reconcile with another person to whom they've wronged. That's an individual thing, one person to another. It's absolutely absurd to say that one individual can't possibly do that or discriminate in a way that has meaningful consequence, et cetera, to somebody else based on their racial characteristics because of some alleged system of power. It's just absurd on its face. But it's also more important to understand that this is actually this is a manipulation in the same shape. I really want to drive that home as Marx's arguments against bourgeois values. Having privilege means being bourgeois. And so when they say, white privilege, what they're actually saying is bourgeois values. If you go back and read what Lenin wrote or read what Mao wrote. And so that's why it's so dangerous. It's not just that it's wrong, it's that it's a very dangerous idea, because it literally does. I mean, we could talk for half an hour about the things that it does wrong. It empowers people to be able to be bullies, just reckless bullies. It disempowers people to defend themselves. Anything that I say in my own defense would be construed as just trying to defend my racism, etc. And on top of that, it's just divisive and leads to this kind of same idea of fracturing society, so that the people who know how this stuff, allegedly know how this stuff works, get driven into positions of power, become a vanguard that then reorganize society, transform, as you say, society into their crackpot vision that's going to be real bad for everybody, except for them. 1% of people do okay under communism.
No, absolutely. Trust me, as you said that, I can almost imagine everyone going, yes, in the audience. James, I must wrap us up. But in saying so, let me just firstly thank you so much for your time. And I'll put a descriptor, or rather a link to your book and the like, and your content in the descriptor of these after this. But perhaps as a final word from you, with America descending down this particular rabbit hole, I'm encouraged to see shoots of, let me call it resistance. And I hate to use that expression also because it's been appropriated by the left. Resist, they tell us. But we are seeing pushback. I mean, there's that school district, I can't think of it right now, where the parents just said enough of critical race theory and took over and literally said, no, this is not for our school. We're not going to teach this nonsense as fact in our school. But talk to me about some of the beginning of people pushing back against this and why that's important.
Okay, there's so much energy behind that right now. I talk to a lot of people, mostly who are Republican politicians, obviously, if I'm talking to politicians, who are recognizing just how much energy there is behind this. But we're even seeing Democratic strategists like James Carville coming out and pointing out that people hate this woke stuff. And he just says it's a messaging problem, but it's much deeper than that. And he's not going to be able to paper over it forever. But you are seeing events like that was in a district in Dallas, Texas, that you're referring to. And they ended up, the media tried to frame a narrative that it was a tightly contested race. It was 70-30. It had a 40-point spread. It was not exactly a tightly contested race. The energy underneath this is incredible. So what the attempt here is, if we put this in, we keep using a kind of neo-Marxist frame, but the attempt here is to have a top-down and bottom-up squeeze at the same time. And what's happened is they have lost the bottom. The bottom has fallen out, which means the harder they press down from the top, which we see from the Biden administration, for example. By the way, the district is not some, gun-toting Texas yeehaw, rootin' tootin' redneck. It slightly went to Biden in the last election. That district actually went slightly Biden, and it was 70-30 against critical race theory in the school. But what we're seeing is the harder they press from the top, like we're seeing in the Biden administration, et cetera, the more bricks fall out of the bottom because they've lost the bottom. The bottom has fallen out. So now we are seeing a genuine grassroots movement. I get talked to literally every day about from people who want to throw money at this, who want to start organizing, from institutions now that want to start doing grassroots activist organizing to push this stuff back out at local and state levels, particularly in the US, but also even, with national races coming up. And so the energy is there in the US. It has woken up. And I think that it can awake in other countries as well. France, it certainly has. South Africa is a possibility, of course, because most people, like you said, most of the time, they just want to live their lives. They don't want this crap theory pushed on them. They don't want to have to figure out reasons to hate their neighbor when they could be having a barbecue or something. We could be going and getting some beer. We got to hate each other. Yeah, this is what people want, right? Their theory is wrong, and the harder they push it now, people have seen it. The harder they push it, the more the bottom falls out. And so there is a lot of reason. Actually, I would have been very, as they say, black pill or dark or gloomy or pessimistic or whatever a month and a half ago had you talked to me then. But I'm actually, I see glimmers of optimism again now. Yeah. There's a lot of money behind it. There's a lot of people who've done a lot to try to push this, and they're not going to just throw that investment away. So it's very scary. But at the same time, they've lost the bottom, and they need top down and bottom up together. And they can't just push. They keep trying these racial narratives, and they don't stick. They keep trying the racial. They try to put the racial narrative on. Oh, it's just a bunch of white supremacists in Texas, and people are like, "Boo!" Nobody accepts it. So they're losing the bottom, and once that happens, there's a lot of hope, because once people realize this is the red pill phenomenon, as they say, once people realize that they're being lied to by this official narrative and the politicians and the elite class in one thing, they start getting real skeptical of everything else, and all of a sudden you can have the possibility for real grassroots liberal activism, like happened in the 18th century, for example. The liberal movements of the 18th and 19th centuries that changed the world for the better in every regard. Those were all underground grassroots happening in the back room of pubs, where you had an innkeeper, a barkeep who would let you have your secret meeting so that the king or whoever couldn't watch you. This is happening again now, whether it's via conversations like this that are obviously on the web, or whether it's happening. I had actually in the past 2 weeks, I've met with 2 groups in person, that just individual small groups of people who are ready to start organizing in proliferate and start fighting this. And I'm assuming that's happening everywhere.
Absolutely. And just to close off, I think we're seeing shoots of it here in South Africa too, where there is a larger proportion of adult voting age South Africans who are not drawn by the let me call it the big three political parties in this country that often push this woke nonsense onto them. There's a larger contingent of them who are eligible to vote, but simply do not vote because their ideals, if you will, the non-racialism, the idea of a South Africa that doesn't harp on about race, that is actually fixed and interested in the future, building a united future, are not represented currently in our politics, and people just choose not to vote. And that number of South Africans is growing. And I would wager, as a final thought, I think those South Africans are waiting for that party, that individual, if you will, who will come rally them on a non-racial message and actually build something which is fundamentally akin to sort of these traditional classical liberal or conservative ideals, if I can put it that way. That'll just be my 2 cents. James, let me say thank you very much. How do the people reach you? And you are now the director of this New Discourses. Do you want to maybe quickly tell us what that's about and if we can reach you through that, if it's something that we should reach you through?
You can try to reach me through Discourses. It might get to me, it might not. I actually have somebody that helps me deal with the volume. I have an insane volume of contact that comes in through that. But it's at newdiscourses.com. That's my website and platform where I try to put out as much information about this critical theory, critical race theory, et cetera, ideology as possible, as fast as possible. I try to make it free. There's no ads on the site. There are on the YouTube videos. You can deal with that. But it's just, I want this information available as widely and freely as possible to as many people as possible. So go check out the website. Best place to reach me is to connect with me on one of the social media platforms, especially Twitter. You reached out to me on Twitter, of course. It's a good place. I'm at Conceptual James on Twitter. If you're interested in following New Discourses, it's at New Discourses. If you're finding, those are the same handles that we've tried to put on every social media platform. I'm just not terribly active on the other ones. I can only handle so much. And I'm pretty active on Twitter. So best place to find me is going to be Twitter at Conceptual James. And you can keep up with my antics. I might not be your style on Twitter, but welcome to the jungle if you follow.
Amen. And shout out to you, James, for that one. James, thank you so much for your time. Super, super appreciated. That, of course, is James Lindsay, straight out of the US, who is, again, someone who you can find at New Discourses. That's www.newdiscourses.com. He's the director of that. And, of course, as you said, you can find him on social media. Thank you, James. Super appreciate that. And thank you for watching this episode of the Big Daddy Liberty Show. Super appreciate that. Please, before you leave, hit that like button. And then, of course, share the link so that more people can watch this show. A big thanks again to our guest, James Lindsay. With that being said, thank you very much. And a reminder to you, as I always say at the end of every show, never trust a commie.